This is Professor Unmack. Bear with me as I try to do a narrated PowerPoint with none of you here to actually contribute to the conversation. It's not going to be nearly as interesting as it is when we have a chance to talk together in class. But I wanted to go over the second set of Hobbes discussion questions and just talk a little bit about the powers that Hobbes argues a government should be authorized to exercise. And certainly in the era in which we're living, where we're seeing a lot more energetic government activity, it's probably an interesting time to be thinking about what the limits of government power should be and the purposes for which we allow the government to exercise more or less power depending on what's going on in the world. So where we left last time, if you remember, before we went to remote learning, we were talking about the natural laws that Hobbes mentions in Leviathan. These are things that Hobbes argues are likely to lead to peace and that would be recognized by any sort of rational person. Remember, Hobbes is all about trying to get people out of a state of nature, which he considers to be a state of war, and into a situation where they can have some hope of living this life of felicity and satisfying desires and over a long period of time without somebody killing us. So we had talked about the first three natural laws, that people should seek peace, that rational people don't want to live in war. The second one was we need to be willing to give up our perfect freedom that we have in a state of nature and the political equality that we have where nobody rules over us in exchange for security. And again, everybody needs to be willing to give up as much of that freedom and equality as everybody else. And then the third thing that we talked about last time we were in class is Hobbes's argument that one of the things that leads to peace is when people keep their promises, when they honor their contracts. And so these are the first three natural laws, and these are the ones that most people talk about when they talk about Thomas Hobbes and the idea of natural law. When we get to Locke, you're going to see that Locke actually boils down this concept of natural law to just sort of one natural law, but Hobbes goes into a little bit more detail. And then I gave you a little writing assignment, and we started to talk about some of the other natural laws, the other things that Hobbes says, hey, you know what, this also leads to peace, and hey, you know, if we all did this, this would also lead. So I just want to kind of finish that up and then get to talking about the Commonwealth and the powers of the sovereign. So these are the ones that we already talked about. This notion that when somebody does something nice for you, you shouldn't make them regret it. That most people don't do nice things to people if they don't expect some level of gratitude back. So that was one of them. Complaisance or sociability. Don't stick out like a sore thumb. Don't be the person who constantly rocks the boat and always wants to be the center of attention and always wants to show up everybody else, to be seen as better than everybody else. It just pisses people off and makes them annoyed. Pardon, the idea that if somebody is truly sorry for what they did, if somebody hurts you and they're truly sorry about it, it's more likely to lead to peace, according to Hobbes, if you are willing to forgive them. You might not want to be around them anymore. You might not necessarily want to be their best buddy anymore. But the idea that Hobbes argues is that if you hold grudges, if you refuse to partner with people in humanity, sort of, it's going to lead to war. You're just going to cause people to resent you and think that you're kind of being a jerk. That's what he says anyway. He also argues that when we are enacting punishments against people who have gone against the law, we ought to do so only for rehabilitation, to make that person understand that what they did was wrong and decide not to do it again, or to deter other people from doing the same thing, but never for revenge. When we act out of a desire for revenge, we're likely to overpunish. We're likely to take things too far, which breeds revenge in return. And so, of course, that doesn't lead to peace. The last two that we were going to talk about before we ran out of time and then ran out of in-person class are the recognizing the equality of others and this notion of equity or modesty. And these things sort of relate to Hobbes's argument that we ought to recognize that in a state of nature, everybody is equal. And we ought to recognize that everybody wants to be seen as equal to everybody else. And so if we are constantly trying to put ourselves out there as deserving of more than others, or deserving of more power, deserving of more money, deserving of more glory, etc., it's going to cause resentment amongst people. People want to be treated equally with everybody else. And then the last one, he calls it equity or modesty. It's this idea that you ought not to be asking for more than you're willing to give everybody else. And again, these things are kind of interrelated with one another. He's trying to suggest that if we're going to live together in a community of people, each of whom kind of thinks they're better than everybody else, it's not going to work if everybody acts on the notion that they're better than everybody else. And so we want to be careful about that. And so Hobbes argues that rational people could figure out that these are things that they ought to do and that everybody ought to do in order to get along. The problem is that the laws of nature don't work very well. They certainly don't work in a state of nature. And what Hobbes argues is that even if you as an individual person could recognize these laws of nature, and everybody might recognize them, not everybody's going to be willing to act on them, and that's going to lead to war because we're afraid of one another. Locke notes a bunch of problems with these laws of nature. The first being that they don't enforce themselves. So the laws of nature are lovely, but if there's nobody to enforce them, if there's nobody to make sure that people don't get punished too harshly, where there's nobody to guarantee that if you abide by the laws of nature, that other people will abide by the laws of nature, then it doesn't work very well. And in a state of nature, of course, there is no enforcement mechanism for any law in the state of nature. And we've talked about that quite a bit. The second thing that Hobbes points out is that we are likely to be biased about how the laws of nature should apply to us. So even when we're rational, even when we recognize that we should treat everybody equitably, we should pardon people who have harmed us if they're truly sorry, we should not punish out of revenge, it's hard. It's a hard thing to do when you feel that somebody has harmed you, when you feel that somebody has done something to you that is sort of egregious. It's easy to let our sort of self-love, our desire to be the one who comes out on top, modify our behavior. And so these laws of nature don't work very well in a state of nature. And sometimes they don't work very well even in civil society. If you see what's happening as people hoard toilet paper or buy up all the hand sanitizer or don't hunker down and shelter in place, but go out to the bars and restaurants when they're told that it would be really nice if you'd stay home so you don't get infected or infect others. This is what Hobbes would have been talking about. He also says that we might recognize them but won't act on them. And these are, not only are we biased about how they should apply to us, but even people who might recognize them won't always act on them. So if you're really, really mad at somebody, for example, and they apologize to you and they sincerely apologize to you, you still might not be willing or able to forgive them. And Hobbes says they're rational, these laws of nature, but we're human. And it's not reasonable to expect human beings to be able to act rationally all the time. And so, again, the state of nature becomes a state of war because these laws of nature, they might be out there, but without some sort of confidence that if you keep your end of the bargain, other people will keep their end of the bargain, nobody will be willing to abide by the laws of nature. And so what ends up happening, according to Hobbes, is that at some point in this thought experiment, people will be able to, this is one of the criticisms of Hobbes. It's actually kind of hard to understand if the state of nature is a state of war, how we actually would get out of it, which is why it's a thought experiment. But if you grant Hobbes a leap of logic, he says that because rational people seek peace, at some point, human beings are going to recognize that the only way that they can get out of a state of war is to set down their weapons and agree to give some of their freedom and equality up in exchange for security. For Hobbes, the reason we form a commonwealth, he calls it a commonwealth, we would call it a state or a government or a constitution or whatever. It's the structure and the laws under which we're going to live. The only reason we would do that is for security and the possibility that comes with security of achieving this felicitous life, this life of satisfying our desires over a long, long period without having to worry that somebody is going to take away our things or more horribly, I guess, take away our lives. And Hobbes argues that the Commonwealth can provide this security by establishing the laws and assuring punishment. Hobbes argues that laws that are not enforced are not worth the paper they're written on. And if people get away with doing bad things or doing things that the law has established are bad things, then the Commonwealth can't achieve the goal that we established the Commonwealth for. And so part of what is really important in Hobbes's political theory is that you have to give the government enough power to ensure that people who break the law will be punished. It's the only way, Hobbes thinks, of getting people to be willing to obey the law. He makes the argument that if there is no fear of punishment, then people won't keep their promises. So if there's no police officer, everybody speeds. If you know that you are going to get away with cheating, or you know you're going to get away with ripping somebody off in a business deal or something like that, Hobbes argues that enough people are going to do that nobody will then be willing to enter into business deals, and they won't start companies together, and they won't hire other people, and other people won't go to work for them, and society will break down, and we'll find ourselves right back in a state of war. So that's a really important part of what Hobbes says. The other thing that's kind of important about what Hobbes says happens when you establish a commonwealth is that you can start to make words like justice, mercy, those kinds of things actually have some meaning. So remember, when we talked about Hobbes' state of nature, we talked about the argument that Hobbes makes that in the state of nature, nothing is just or unjust. Nothing is right or wrong. Hobbes argues that you can have a system of law only when you've got a system of government, because in a state of nature, you're on your own to preserve your own life. And so you're sort of a law unto yourself, and so is everybody else. And so we form this commonwealth. A commonwealth by institution is a commonwealth that reflects the idea of the social contract. The social contract being that people give up willingly some of their freedom and equality, or in Hobbes's words, as much as everybody else is willing to give up, in order to have some security. So we give up we agree to be governed, as opposed to being taken over by another country or conquered in war or something like that. And that would be a different type of commonwealth. Hobbes doesn't make the argument that you can't transfer your allegiance to a conquering government. It's just a different kind of commonwealth. It's a different way of establishing a commonwealth. And what Hobbes argues is that what the people would set up when they set up a social contract and they agree to live under a government is this government by institution. So, oh, sorry, I already did that. I'm a little bit ahead of my PowerPoint. That does not surprise me. I even have it printed out. So the security comes from the social contract, and Hobbes makes the argument that everyone is the author of the Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth is created by all of the people who have given up their freedom and equality and turned over the power to keep them safe to this Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth can be instituted however the people want to institute it. It can be a democracy, it can be a monarchy, it can be an oligarchy or an aristocracy. Hobbes has a preference. He thinks that some forms of government work better than others, but a commonwealth can be set, any kind of commonwealth can be set up if the people agree to it. And then that makes everybody part of the commonwealth and a creation of the commonwealth. And this is where we get this idea that by participating in this social contract, we're actually living under laws that we created for ourselves. So even in the modern times, when we agree, Hobbes would argue that by electing people to office, we are agreeing to live under the laws that those people create. And it's sort of as if we are indirectly making those laws ourselves. The thing that a lot of people quibble with when it comes to Hobbes is this notion that people should be willing to give as much power to the government as is necessary for the government to keep the peace. And Hobbes argues that people should be willing to essentially give the Commonwealth unlimited power. He believes that a strong, centralized, active, forceful government is the best bet for keeping people safe. They can punish people quickly if they break the law. It's very clear what the law is when the government has a lot of power. Hobbes thinks that most of the government's power should be vested in one body. He doesn't think it should be a hereditary monarchy, but he's not opposed to the people giving power to one group of people. So some of you have studied this in Poli-Sci 301, or you studied it in comparative politics as well, this notion of a unitary government as opposed to a confederal form of government where there's lots of state governments and a really weak national government, or the system that we have now, which Hobbes would never have heard of before because it was created in 1787 when we adopted the Constitution. But today we have federalism, and Hobbes would probably argue that federalism is a less efficient form of government, that it's more likely that people are going to get away with things, or it's going to be harder to solve problems when you've got so many different governments trying to solve the problems. Think about what's going on right now with different states adopting different policies with regard to the COVID-19, and also the federal government responding in ways that either some states like or some states don't like. If you listened to Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, talking this morning, he was talking about the need for all of the states to act together rather than each state acting individually. He said, for example, if the state of New York closes down all the bars and restaurants and people can just go into New Jersey, which doesn't close the bars and restaurants, then not only are people potentially contracting the virus and bringing it back into New York and infecting people, but, and he didn't say this, but I think this was sort of an unspoken point, the restaurants and bars in New York suffer and the restaurants and bars in New Jersey do not. So he was calling for this sort of cooperation amongst these government entities, which can be hard to do. And what Hobbes would argue is that you shouldn't have that. You should have one place where all the power is being exercised. And so I think a lot of people in the United States kind of chafe a little bit about at this idea of unlimited government power. But Hobbes argues that if you want peace, if you want people to be secure, then you have to be willing to give the government a lot of power. We don't have to agree with Hobbes, but you do, for purposes of this class, you need to understand. And so A lot of what you wrote on in your discussion questions has to do with the rights of the sovereign, and so I just wanted to kind of go over those um, relatively quickly. I'm mindful that I'm at the 20 minute mark, so hopefully, if this PowerPoint ends up getting a little bit long, you can stop it and start it and listen to parts of it and um, listen to parts of it again if you think it absolutely fabulous. It's really hard for me, I will tell you, if I can digress for just a minute. It's really hard for me to sit here in my home office and narrate a PowerPoint without you guys being there to participate in the discussion. It feels very odd. So anyway, back to the rights of the sovereign. One of the things that is going to be very different between Hobbes and Locke, who we're going to be studying next, is that Hobbes argues that the social contract is absolute. In other words, once you've established it, you're obligated to live under it. It sort of takes on a life of its own. And so for Hobbes, there is no right of revolution. He recognizes that revolution could happen because he's lived at a time of revolution, but he doesn't think it's ever just for the people to rise up against their government. The argument is it's not really convoluted, but it's a little bit of a difficult argument. Essentially, what Hobbes argues is that the social contract is between the people who give the government their power, and that the sovereign, whoever the sovereign ends up being, he calls it the sovereign, which makes it sound like one person, but it doesn't have to be one person. It could be a group of people. Hobbes argues that the sovereign isn't actually part of the social contract, that the sovereign is separate from the social contract, and the sovereign cannot violate the social contract because he's not a part of it. So what Hobbes argues is that once you give the government the power and the responsibility to keep you safe, whatever they decide is necessary to keep you safe is just. Because there is no natural justice or injustice. There only is what keeps people safe and what doesn't keep people safe. So what Hobbes argues is that the sovereign, because the sovereign can't violate the social contract, and because there is nothing just or unjust until the sovereign defines justice and injustice, nothing the sovereign does is unjust. And because nothing the sovereign does is unjust, the sovereign could then never be justly punished. So a revolution is essentially unfair to the sovereign. It's a violation of the sovereign's right to exercise power. He doesn't put it exactly that way, but that's sort of what his argument boils down to. Now, for people who have grown up learning about the Declaration of Independence and the importance of the people keeping for themselves the ultimate power of deciding how they're governed, this sounds kind of harsh. But for Hobbes, if the purpose of government is to keep people safe, if the purpose of government is to make sure that nobody kills you, that you get paid, that you don't suffer at the hands of others, the likelihood that that will happen goes up if the government has a lot of power, and if the government gets to decide right and wrong and justice and injustice. Again, we're coming back to this argument that Thrasymachus made, that justice is whatever the government says it is. And so Hobbes makes that argument. So continuing on with what the rights of the sovereign, and I asked you to write about some of these in your discussion questions, but the rights of the sovereign include the power to censor, because some ideas might be dangerous and they might cause people to wonder about whether they should obey the law, or they might glorify revolution. And Hobbes argues that the sovereign should be given the power to determine what ideas can be discussed and read and written about, and what cannot, as long as in the interest of keeping people safe. Now, obviously, we don't like the idea of censorship in the United States, but all of these powers, the power to determine all civil and criminal law. Again, Hobbes is arguing here in particular for a separation of church and state. He doesn't think that people should be, that the church should be dictating policy, and he doesn't think that the church should be determining what the law is, because different religious leaders have different ideas about what the law is, and that causes uncertainty, and it causes chaos, and it causes revolution. So Hobbes wants the power to determine all civil and criminal law to rest in the sovereign. We're actually having kind of a debate in this country about the amount of power that the president ought to be able to exercise over all of these independent boards and commissions that have been established over time, like the Federal Election Commission and the Federal Communications Commission. There's some debate about whether or not, as head of the executive branch, the president should have more authority over who gets appointed to those positions and the kinds of policies they come up with. It's actually a really interesting debate. He says that the government, the sovereign, should have the sole judicial power, that the government should be able to determine whether somebody has broken the law, etc. He makes the argument that no sovereign should willingly transfer any of that power because it weakens the Commonwealth and it can make it more difficult to keep the peace. And it divides. He doesn't like the idea of divided power. He wouldn't like separation of powers and checks and balances. He probably wouldn't like federalism as concepts because they make things messy and they make it difficult to get things done. So he doesn't think that any of that should be done. He actually argues against separation of powers. He thinks that the legislative, judicial, and executive power should all be vested in the same body. Now, obviously, the reason he wants that is so that the judges and the people who wrote the law and the people who carry out the law will all be on the same page. They'll all agree on what should be right and wrong. They'll all agree that the laws need to be enforced and that you won't get an executive branch that doesn't enforce laws that it doesn't really like that come from the legislative branch, and you won't get judges who don't really agree with the law, so they punish people really lightly, or right. So you can understand the concerns that somebody like Hobbes, who wants the government to be strong and powerful so that people will be kept safe, that he would have a problem with separation of powers. So Hobbes argues for a really strong government with lots and lots of power, including the power to censor and to determine what the law is. And he recognizes that one of the criticisms that people are going to levy at him is that the people will be really unhappy living under this form of government, that it'll be too rigid, that it'll be too restrictive, that they won't be allowed to do anything, that they'll be constantly told what they're allowed to read and that kind of stuff. And Hobbes has a pretty simple answer to that. He makes the argument that there is nothing worse than living in a state of nature. And that life under any government, even an imperfect one, is going to be better than living in a state of nature. So he's basically telling people that life isn't about them being happy. Life is about them being safe. And he makes the argument that the sovereign doesn't have an incentive to treat people badly. He doesn't have an incentive to make the law more restrictive than it needs to be to keep the peace, and that any sovereign will recognize that even if it's unjust to revolt, even if it's unjust for people to give their loyalty to another sovereign, it's possible that it could happen if people are unhappy or if people feel like they're not being treated fairly under the law, that they might be willing to turn their allegiance to another country. They might not be willing to fight for the sovereign if the country is invaded. And so Hobbes makes the argument that even though the government should be given unlimited power, in most cases you wouldn't have to worry about the government abusing its power because its purpose is to keep people safe, and you keep people safe by keeping things peaceful. Now, most people in the Western world don't want to give the government that kind of power, but that's sort of trust us, give us lots of power and then trust us. We have no interest in treating you badly. That doesn't always go over well when you talk to people about it. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and I'm trying to make this PowerPoint as short as possible, but here I am going to the 30-minute mark. He has a section in the Leviathan about what the rights of the people are. And essentially what Hobbes argues is that, oh, sorry, those both flew in at the same time, that because the government decides what the law is, because the government decides what's legal and what's not legal, what that essentially means is that the only restrictions placed on people are the restrictions placed on their behavior by the sovereign. And the people are free to do whatever the sovereign has not told them they can't do. In fact, that's the way our law works here in the United States. If it's not illegal under the law, then you can do it. And there's got to be some policy in place that says you can't do it. And sometimes we change the law and we make things that used to be legal illegal, and used to be illegal legal. So we made talking on your cell phone without a hands-free device illegal. So it used to be legal, and now it's illegal. And we made smoking marijuana for recreational use in California legal. It used to be illegal, but now it's legal. And Hobbes says that that's appropriate. The people are free to do whatever the government has not told them they're not allowed to do. And he thinks that people are actually more free under the government than they would be in a state of nature. So you've got this perfect freedom in the state of nature, but because you can't exercise that liberty because you're constantly afraid, so you can't develop industry, you can't develop wealth, you can't have any leisure time because you're constantly trying to find enough food and find a shelter and fend off other people who might want to take your shelter away. You're actually more free under government because you can turn that burden, you can give that burden of preservation over to the government, and the government will then in turn keep you safe and punish people who break the law. So that's sort of Hobbes in a nutshell. Feel free to read more of Hobbes's Leviathan if you are so inclined to do so. I will be in my virtual office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So if you feel like clicking on the Confer Zoom button in our Canvas course and coming in just to say hi or to chat or to get clarification about stuff or vent or whatever, I would love to see you. I would. It's sad. I miss you guys, and I will talk to you later. Now I'm trying to figure out how to end the recording.